No one told him to stop. But Ace Frehley stopped. The stage fell into silence, and everyone waited for him to understand what the moment wanted. Detroit. 1978, Cobo Hall. 15,000 people packed into an arena that smelled like sweat and beer and anticipation. Kiss was 3 songs into their set. The lights were blazing. The pyrotechnics had already gone off twice. Gene Simmons had spit blood. Paul Stanley had worked the crowd into a frenzy. And then it was time for Ace Frehley's solo. The stage lights dimmed. A single spotlight found Ace at stage right. He stood alone with his Gibson Les Paul, the silver paint on his face catching the light, his space-themed costume reflecting fragments of illumination back into the darkness. The arena roared. 15,000 voices screaming for the spaceman, for the guitar solo they'd paid to hear, for the pyrotechnic display that always accompanied Ace's moment in the spotlight. Ace raised his hand. His fingers hovered over the strings. And he didn't play. He stood there, completely still. His hand suspended above the guitar like a question waiting for an answer. The roar began to fade. The crowd quieted, uncertain. Seconds passed. 5. 10. 15. Backstage, the tour manager grabbed his headset. "What's happening? Is his amp dead? Did we lose sound?" The sound engineer checked his board. "No. Everything's live. He's just not playing." On stage, Ace Frehley remained frozen. His body language wasn't panic. It wasn't confusion. It was something else entirely. It was listening. Ace didn't defend himself. He never did. To understand what happened in that Detroit arena, you need to understand what happened 3 weeks earlier in a recording studio in Los Angeles. Kiss was between albums. The band had taken a rare break from touring to work on new material. They'd rented out a studio in Hollywood. One of those expensive places with vintage equipment, and a control room that looked like a spaceship cockpit. The producer they'd hired was a man named Marcus Devlin. Big name in the industry. Worked with all the major acts. Expensive. Opinionated. The kind of producer who believed his vision mattered more than the band's. Marcus had a particular view of Kiss. To him, they were spectacle over substance. Makeup and pyrotechnics covering for mediocre musicianship. He'd said as much in interviews before taking the job, which should have been a warning sign, but the label wanted him and the label was paying. On the 3rd day of sessions, they were working on a new track. Complex arrangement. Multiple guitar layers. The kind of song that required precision and patience. Ace was in the live room, headphones on, guitar plugged directly into the board. Marcus was in the control room with the rest of the band, watching through the glass. They'd been at it for 2 hours. Ace laying down track after track, building the guitar parts piece by piece. He worked quietly, methodically, rarely speaking between takes. Just playing, listening to the playback through his headphones, nodding, playing again. Marcus leaned into his talkback microphone. "Ace, that last take was close, but I need more emotion. It's too technical. Too calculated." Ace didn't respond. He just adjusted his guitar strap and waited for the next take. "Did you hear me?" Marcus pressed. "I said it needs more emotion. Less thinking, more feeling." Paul Stanley, sitting in the control room, shifted uncomfortably. "Marcus, maybe we should." "I'm the producer," Marcus interrupted. "This is what you're paying me for. Honest feedback." He hit the talkback button again. "Ace, I know you're used to playing for crowds who just want flash and fire, but in the studio, we need substance. We need you to actually feel the music, not just perform it." The control room went quiet. Gene and Paul exchanged glances. The engineer stared at his console. Everyone in that room knew what Marcus didn't. You could criticize Ace Frehley's playing. You could ask him to change his approach. But you didn't question whether he felt the music. Ace, in the live room, stood completely still for a long moment. Then he carefully removed his guitar, set it in its stand, and took off his headphones. He walked to the door, opened it, and stepped into the hallway. "Where's he going?" Marcus asked. Gene Simmons stood up from the couch. "You just told him he doesn't feel the music." "I was giving him direction. That's my job." "No," Paul said quietly. "You told him he's all show and no substance." "That's different." Marcus shrugged. "If he can't handle honest criticism, maybe he shouldn't be in the studio." Ace didn't come back that day. Or the next day. On the third day, Marcus was replaced by a different producer, and Ace walked back into the studio without a word, picked up his guitar, and laid down every track perfectly in single takes. He never mentioned what Marcus had said. Never defended himself. Never explained. Subscribe and leave a comment, because some moments only make sense when we remember them together. But 3 weeks later, standing on that Detroit stage with his hand hovering over the guitar strings and 15,000 people waiting, Ace Frehley was thinking about what Marcus Devlin had said. Not because it hurt him. Not because it made him angry. Because it made him aware of something he'd always known but never articulated: the difference between playing and waiting to play. The difference between filling silence because you're afraid of it, and letting silence exist because it has something to say. Marcus had been wrong about almost everything. But he'd been accidentally right about one thing: Ace did think while he played. He calculated. He measured. He waited for the right moment instead of forcing moments that weren't ready. That's what made him different from 1,000 other guitarists who could play faster, louder, with more technical precision. Ace understood that music wasn't just notes. It was the space between notes. The decision of when not to play. And right now, on this Detroit stage, with the spotlight burning down and the crowd beginning to murmur in confusion, the moment wasn't ready yet. So Ace waited. His hand remained suspended above the strings. His breathing slow and even. His eyes closed behind the silver makeup. Listening. Not to the crowd. Not to the band. To something deeper. To the moment itself, asking him what it needed. The silence stretched. 20 seconds. 25. 30. Backstage, the tour manager was frantic. "We need to do something. The crowd's getting restless. If he doesn't..." Paul Stanley, watching from the wings, held up his hand. "Give him a minute." "A minute? He's been standing there for..." "Give him a minute." On stage, Gene had stopped moving. Usually during Ace's solo, Gene would be on the other side of the stage, staying in character, keeping the energy up. But now he stood perfectly still, bass hanging from his shoulder, watching Ace with an expression that might have been concern or might have been understanding. The crowd's murmur was getting louder. Some people were starting to shout. "Play something! What's wrong? Is he okay?" Ace's hand trembled slightly. Not from nervousness. From the effort of holding still when every instinct screamed at him to fill the silence, to give them what they expected, to perform. But he waited. And then, at exactly 37 seconds, though no one was counting except the sound engineer who would later tell this story in bars for the next 20 years, something shifted. The quality of the silence changed. The crowd's restlessness transformed into something else. Anticipation. Focus. 15,000 people leaning forward in their seats, holding their breath, suddenly understanding that they were witnessing something they'd never seen before. Ace felt it. That shift. That moment when the silence stopped being empty and became full. His fingers touched the strings. Away from the spotlight, Ace made a choice no one expected. He didn't play the solo he'd practiced. He didn't play the solo the crowd expected. He didn't play anything fast or flashy or designed to impress. He played a single note. Clean. No distortion. No effects. Just one pure note from the Les Paul, held long and steady, allowed to decay naturally in the arena's acoustics. The crowd went silent. Ace let that note die completely. Let the silence return. Then he played another note. Different pitch. Same purity. Same patience. Note by note, with long spaces of silence between each one. Ace Frehley built something that wasn't a guitar solo in any conventional sense. It was a conversation between sound and silence. Between what was played and what was deliberately not played. The arena was so quiet you could hear people breathing. 15,000 people, completely still, listening to a man play a guitar like it was the first time anyone had ever touched strings. Gene Simmons, watching from across the stage, felt something he rarely felt, genuine awe. He'd played with Ace for years. He'd heard him play 1,000 solos. But this was different. This wasn't performance. This was truth. After 2 minutes, though it felt both longer and shorter than that, Ace finally let his guitar open up. The distortion kicked in. The speed increased. He played the solo they'd come to hear, but now it meant something different because of the silence that had preceded it. When he finished, the arena exploded. Not the manufactured roar of people who'd gotten what they paid for. Something deeper. The sound of people who'd witnessed something unexpected. Something real. What followed silenced everyone in the room. After the show, in the dressing room, Ace sat alone with his guitar case, carefully wiping down his Les Paul. The rest of the band was in the hallway doing the usual post-show routine, signing autographs, talking to local radio people, decompressing. There was a knock on the door. Yeah. The door opened. It wasn't Gene or Paul or anyone from the crew. It was Marcus Devlin. Ace looked up but didn't say anything. Marcus stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, looking uncomfortable in a way producers rarely look. "I was in the audience tonight," he said. Ace nodded slowly. Went back to cleaning his guitar. "That thing you did," Marcus continued. "The silence before the solo. That was—" He stopped, searching for words. "I've been producing records for 15 years. I thought I understood what separates good players from great ones. But what you did tonight—" Ace still didn't speak. Just kept wiping down the strings, one at a time, with the same patience he'd shown on stage. "In the studio," Marcus said, "I told you that you didn't feel the music. That you were all technique and no emotion. I remember. I was wrong." Ace finally looked up. "Okay. That's it. Just okay? What do you want me to say?" Marcus stepped into the room. "I want to know how you did that. How you stood in front of 15,000 people and just waited. How you trusted the silence like that. How you knew when to play and when not to." Ace set down his cloth. Looked at Marcus for a long moment. "You don't feel music here," he said, tapping his chest. "You feel it in the space between you and everyone else. In the waiting. If you fill every second because you're afraid of silence, you never hear what the music actually wants to say." He picked up his guitar, settled it across his lap, and played a single note. Let it ring out in the small dressing room. Let it decay completely before he spoke again. "You hear that?" "Hear what?" "Exactly." Marcus stood there, understanding slowly dawning. "The silence after. The silence is part of the song," Ace said. "Most people are too scared to let it in." He carefully placed his guitar back in its case, closed the latches with precise clicks. When he looked up again, Marcus was still standing there. "I owe you an apology," the producer said. "You already gave it." "No, I mean a real one. In the studio I don't need it," Ace interrupted, not unkindly. "You said what you thought. I played what I know. We're good." He stood up, guitar case in hand. "But next time you're in a studio with someone, try waiting before you talk. See what the silence tells you." Marcus nodded slowly. "Can I ask you one more thing?" "Sure." "How did you know?" "Tonight." "How did you know when the moment was ready?" Ace paused at the door. "I didn't." "That's the point. You wait until it tells you. And if you're wrong, you were wrong. But at least you listened." He walked out, leaving Marcus standing alone in the dressing room. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. That Detroit show became legendary. Not because of pyrotechnics or speed or technical flash. Because 15,000 people watched a man choose silence over performance, and trust over fear. Years later, young guitarists would ask Ace about technique, about gear, about how to play faster. He'd always give the same answer. Learn to wait. The guitar will tell you when it's ready. The Les Paul he played that night was never sold. It sits in a private collection now, but Ace visits it sometimes. He picks it up, plays a single note, and waits. Listening to what the silence says. Some moments ask you to perform. Others ask you to wait. The difference is knowing which is which.